So one of the kind of narratives I grew up with in the evangelical world and in other church cultures is an anxiety about decline, anxiety about shrinking churches, shrinking congregations, the kingdom of God itself being kind of on the back foot or that kind of thing. I've found as things have developed, as more questions have emerged and people have felt freer to explore things, that anxiety isn't really there, certainly in the post-evangelical world, where I think the desire to hold on to power or the desire to sort of absorb the world into your paradigm is seen as not a good thing. Perhaps decline is almost celebrated in certain ways. In some circles. I'm wondering whether those kind of anxieties about shrinkage and decline and, the sense that the church is being edged out of the world by secularism have been part of, the conversations you've been in and over the years.
Yes, I think, in some ways I envy your... I don't pretend to fully understand, but I think I understand sufficiently that the evangelical background is a much more fluid, in the best sense of the term, flexible approach. I think I know enough about it historically that there are also very rigid sort of points in it as well. I'm not looking at it with rose-coloured spectacles, but I do think that by and large, if you're comparing the evangelical tradition and the Catholic tradition, the flexibility that I would presume is around in an evangelical tradition is a lot freer than it has been within a more structured Catholic sort of position. So the way that plays out, I think it's playing out in both situations. I'd be surprised if it wasn't. But I think the way it plays out may be at very different rates and in very different ways. So, for instance, within the Catholic tradition, the emphasis on the ordination of the clergy, of the role of sacraments, of the way that the clergy sort of administer sacraments, means that if there's a decline in the number of men available, and it is only men, don't forget, in the Catholic Church at present, who can administer those sacraments, then the sense of structures being weakened and of decline and of a sort of a drawing in, I suspect are probably more intense and in some ways perhaps more difficult to deal with than perhaps in the tradition that you're coming from. But there may be huge generalizations in what I'm saying there. But certainly from the point of view of coming back to my own situation, when I joined the Passionists, we are divided as we're an international congregation, not a huge one, but we are in all the different continents of the world. But each place is divided into separate groups. We call them provinces. So within the province that is the one I belong to in this country, when I first joined, I think we numbered round about 120 or so members, which was a reasonable number. I was also part of a group that had joined, and there were 4 or 5 of us in our group. So that was again a significant sort of increase in terms of new people coming in. If you contrast that with where we are now, we're down to probably about 16 or 17 men in our province. Our age profile is that much higher, and the numbers of people, or the non-existent people who are not joining the order, mean that there's a certain inevitable sort of decline that is very, very obvious and is causing various pressures. However, the other side of that is that as a particular boundary becomes less fixed or more porous, whichever way you look at it, there opens up possibilities of different ways of actually modelling the way that we actually move forward together. So that even though our numbers of of ordained, vowed passionists has so dramatically declined to the point where can we carry on as a province, for instance, is a question that is debated. Paradoxically, there are increasingly larger numbers of people who have perhaps been attracted by the underlying spirituality, the underlying sort of vision of the Passionists, and while not wanting to join in terms of the way I joined and become fully fledged, members signed up for, in which case they'd have to be men anyway, because it's been an all male situation. But they want to be associated with. They want to be part of the journey. So the interesting dilemma that we're facing at the moment is how does an old organisation which has still got energy and enthusiasm, and to which I feel as committed now as I did 60 years ago when I first joined, how does that maintain its journey forward in a way that respects its integrity in terms of the vision, but recognises that structurally what previously worked is no longer working? So you've got a juncture of where people are sort of saying, well, we want to count as Passionists, but we would count ourselves as Passionists living in a different sort of way. So the tensions between managing that are interesting, to say the least, quite often fraught. And I don't know whether that was where, I think I've said to you before, that this friend of mine, Austin, who was a very charismatic, poetic, prophetic sort of voice, who was for whom I shall always be grateful that he led the way into this process for me. And he was very good at coming up with poetic aphorisms, and borrowed or original, I'm not always sure. But one that he used a lot was this one of saying that the two key roles in anybody's life, actually, but certainly in ours, are the two key roles of being an undertaker and of being a midwife. And he said that what we need to learn is how to combine those two roles, because they're equally important and you can't have one without the other. So the undertaker, his role or her role is to recognize, push the analogy to its obvious physical thing, recognize when somebody is dead and help that person to be buried in the context of their life in a way that's respectful and recognizes what they've done. The role of the midwife is to say, well, where is new life coming to birth, and what help does this birth need? How does the new growth be nurtured in the first instance? Now that sounds poetically, it sounds, that sounds good, which it is. Putting that into practice and working it politically, so that you respect the process, because it's not like a sudden, well, you're dead, you're gone, and here's new life, come on in. That's where the paradox is. And I feel that's the particular, I think it's a paradox that doesn't just apply to the Passionists. I don't think it's applicable just to the Catholic Church. I would suggest that in most people's lives these days, the same sort of tensions, theologically, politically, socially, are happening on a worldwide basis in a way that perhaps is classic. This change has always taken place, we know, but I think the pace of change and the implications of change in our present world are such that we all need to take stock and sort of say, well, how do we manage that union between the undertaker and the midwife?
I suppose the pain in that image is that, the undertaker's, someone who's paid, the outsider who is able to
in our society, yeah. Other societies, it wouldn't be the outsider.
Well, yeah. Maybe there's the image we need to draw on, because often we're having to do the gut-wrenching thing of being the undertaker of our own paradigm.
Right. And perhaps culturally, a lot of different cultures. This is coming back to you and I being a white male Europeans, privileged. Perhaps for example, in many African countries, perhaps the midwife and the undertaker were almost the same person, paradoxically.
Right. And then the thing of the midwife's task, the task of facilitating the new beginning, new life, but perhaps it's not you. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it doesn't look like you. Perhaps it doesn't bear a resemblance to the things that you knew well and feel comfortable with. I'm fascinated by the Quakers I've met in recent times, and also I should say that the circles I'm in, there's a lot of people are drawing on those wells. A lot of people are fascinated by the Quakers as an example, perhaps as a map of alternative approaches to being in the world and giving away one's treasures. But I suppose the thing with the Quakers at the moment, it's a shrinking group, like all of them, I guess, almost all of them. And yet, I know so many people who admire the Quakers so much. The strange thing is, everybody I know loves the Quakers, but nobody wants to be a Quaker. And the Quakers I know seem mostly all right with that. They seem happy to give away their treasures without demanding that you then, demanding membership or something like that. Which casts my mind to the sort of radicalism of the first century and that early Messianic movement, where essentially what I see is people who were Jewish and understood themselves to be within the Jewish religion and never saw themselves as having left it, giving away the treasures of what they were carrying without demanding membership, without demanding that you...
Although some of them were demanding membership, weren't they?
Well, yeah, so, I mean, there you go. You see both sides of that debate inevitably happening.
Yeah.
Those who are willing to be midwives to something that looks different to themselves, without losing themselves in that process. And then those, I suppose, a conservative impulse to...
I mean, you see it with... just I know I'm interrupting you there, but Peter and Paul were key examples of that. Peter was coming in torn between, on the one hand, wanting to sort of like be open to this new movement, but torn with the Jerusalem group that was holding him back. Paul was coming in from a very different sort of background and was struggling himself in terms of, and it was the two of them coming together, sort of epitomise really the point you're making, and I think that carries on in the early church.
Yeah, I think leaning into the tension that's going on there. Somehow I think we often miss it because we absorb the meaning of our sacred texts into the paradigm of our castle.
Yes, absolutely.
We sort of manage to not see all the ways in which really it's taking apart your castle if you're willing to take it seriously. I'm interested in where you see glimmers of that alternative approach. One language for it is the undertaker and the midwife. Another language for it is the giving away of your treasures without demanding something in return. Have you seen glimmers of that in your realm? And
I think so.
Doing what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean there are many examples of people who are like, what you need to look for, I think, is where is the energy? Where are the people who are enthusiastic about something? And I think it's not too hard to find examples of that. It's not always coherent, or it doesn't always necessarily fit into a neat sort of paradigm. Two examples come to mind. One is a group that I was I helped to start some 10, 15 years ago. And I'd had a job of being provincial for a time, which is sort of a leadership role in the order. And I'd come out of that job. And the local parish priest in Liverpool, who was a good friend, rang me up one day and he says, Nicholas, will you come and do, as we call it, a supply? What meant was, if he was away for the weekend, would I come and serve for him and do the masses? And so I said, well, I'd prefer not to, George. I says, if you're really stuck, I will. But he said, well, why not? I said, I just don't want to sort of feel that I've got to keep it going. You have a mass every Sunday and people come, and I'd be the one coming in and keeping it going. Could we not do something different? So he said, like what? So I said, well, could we start a conversation within your parish group, open-ended, not in a closed church setting, sort of look at a theme or look at some of the scriptures or whatever. So George agreed that I would do that, and that started, and a group of people started congregating around that, And they were people who were willing to ask questions, who were part of the Catholic tradition mostly, not entirely. Some of them were not. But who were open to say, well, we want something more than just sort of fitting into the way that we normally go through the religious celebrations each week. We decided eventually to call it the vestibule. And that was the name vestibule I took from one of my favourite poets, which is R.S. Thomas, and he's written a poem. One of his poems is entitled The Vestibule, and it describes him. He was an Anglican vicar, and he was Welsh, and he wanted to be more Welsh than anybody else. And it was a tension in his life between being a part of the Anglican Church, but also having this deep Welsh nationalism within him. And he wrote this particular poem on one occasion where he described himself in his little country parish, and he'd gone to lock the church up, and he'd locked the church door, and the poem describes him standing there, and he says, I don't know how long I stood there, but I was not in the church, but I wasn't outside it, and that's why he called it the vestibule. It's in and yet not in. And we decided that the group, as it was developing, was going to, that name sort of fitted us. We wanted to be part of this Catholic tradition, but we wanted to feel free that we could take it where our lives were taking us and where we were going. So that's one little example. That group is still going. It's presently, it's drawn other people in. We've got 2 people who are asylum seekers, actually, who are living in the place where we meet, and we've made them welcome. So it's not just a sort of an introverted scripture type, navel-gazing exercise. There's a commitment in different ways from the people who are in it. So that's one example, and I'm sure there are many more like that. The other example I would suggest is that the present Pope, to my mind, has brought a breath of fresh air, much needed, to the Catholic tradition. And he's written a couple of important letters, which we call encyclicals. One is all about the climate challenge and it's called Laudato Si, which is taken from a poem by St. Francis of Assisi. And the other one is called, in Italian, it's Fratelli Tutti, which is probably not a good name because it means to all brothers. And quite naturally, a lot of people say, well, what about sisters? But that's a typical sort of Catholic sort of, blind spot, and I'm not minimizing it, it's tragic. But the letter itself is worth reading. And a bit of it I was reading the other day where he was saying, have we got to become much more local? Is there a need to sort of develop the local initiatives? Where do you belong? What's your belonging place? Is it your family? Is it slightly wider than that? And I'm keeping in mind the question that I think you started me off on this particular bit, where how do we begin to sort of marry the larger view of where a religious tradition is coming from and the specific expressions of that locally? The Quakers you gave the example of, I think, is a wonderful example because they have focused in a marvellous way on the local group, and they are very generous and open, as you've rightly sort of mentioned, in the way that they share their enthusiasm, and they're liked. I agree with you. The danger with the Catholic tradition is because we've had this more universal, international, global sort of Catholic sort of claim, we are the true church at its worst claim. That means it's more difficult for us to accommodate ourselves in terms of finding the local expression in the way that perhaps the Quakers and other traditions are better able to do. Like I worked for a number of years in the local Methodist. I was the coordinator of the local Methodist church in Liverpool. And I have tremendous admiration for the Methodists in terms of the way they've translated practical action with their spiritual sort of coming together. So I'm basically agreeing with the premise that you gave me at the start of this one.
I think one of the a resonant concept to the vestibule one you mentioned with R.S. Thomas. People I know will talk about the court of the Gentiles, and the idea that in the Jewish temple there's the court where kind of anybody can go.
Yeah.
And just the notion that that was the exciting place to be.
Yes.
The place where there was a dialogue of difference. And I suppose there's, people in my world who would much rather be
in the court of the Gentiles.
In the court of the Gentiles, in the space of difference.
I think I would as well.
Yeah. To speak into what you mentioned earlier, I suppose the fluidity of evangelicalism. That's true. There's ways in which sort of a large, overbearing sort of hierarchical structure that joins, that all different expressions of this thing are sort of answerable to, isn't there as a sort of free in that respect. But then, of course, power has to finds its, if it's not aware of itself, then it finds some way of creating a hierarchical order that controls. And I guess in those circles it would often be in the realm of theology, belief, language. You have to make the right kind of noises about belief and theology, or it's often quite homogenous in that respect. I'm sure that's not across the board, but I think that's been a lot of people's experience in those realms, and then that finds its form in perhaps quite explicit forms of patriarchy, perhaps subtle and implicit forms of racism or discrimination, explicit discrimination against people of different sexual identities and so on. So all those kinds of power questions are there in some form, but then it's very different, and it's strange looking over at other Protestant realms like the Church of England, where again it has a very hierarchical, complicated structure that's many of the people I know in that realm have a hard time living in the midst of all of that power and complexity, and then there seems a much more diverse space for belief and behaviour and action within that realm. All kinds of different ways that works out.
But perhaps it comes back to your song, the Tower of Babel. Perhaps we're having to revisit the basic human sort of solidarity that exists between us all, and be very cautious about any structures we put on it. The structure is there to serve the human reality, not the other way round. And perhaps that's, I've not heard your song, but I could well imagine that basic myth of the Babylonian Tower, or the Tower of Babel rather, is equally valid today as it was when it was first told.
Yeah, I think it's the liminality of the present that gives me a lot of hope. It's almost upon us whether we wanted it or not. It's happened almost without us choosing for it to happen. We are beginning to exchange. We're beginning to enter into this massive exchange of experiences. I think the more intentionally we lean into it, the better we can do it, and the better things can happen with it. The more we resist it, the more ugly energies emerge. But that.
And at the heart of it, there's always got to be authentic conversation, surely, because only when there's authentic conversation, and by authentic conversation, I don't mean sort of necessarily soul-bearing, but where words mean what you try to make the words mean what you're trying to say, and that they're understood and listened to. And I feel that's at the heart of it. If there's authentic conversation, who knows what will happen? If it isn't authentic, then no matter what structure you have, it's going to be manipulated or it's going to be lost. Bit of a generalisation again, but...
Well, no, I think that is the heart of what's going on. It takes the form of conversation across lines of difference, and the truer they are, the more remarkable things happen.